Well, it was another week of heat, but not much light as the great carbon tax debate continued. Around the time Labor received a hefty lift in voter sentiment, a citizens' uprising against the tax was bussed into Canberra with their colourful and questionable placards, and the brawling and name-calling continued unabated. But as Neil Woolrich reports, some more sober assessments on the tax are emerging outside of the circus.
What do we want?
She lied to you!
From noisy street protests to stoushes on the floor of Parliament.
And I criticise the judgment of this man.
The debate about the proposed carbon tax just won't go away.
Australians are disgusted by his negativity and revolted by his arrogance.
To stop evading and start explaining.
I am complaining very loud about the proposed carbon tax.
Also feeling the heat is the new head of Treasury. Appearing before a Senate committee this week, Martin Parkinson used earlier Treasury modelling to hose down suggestions that a price on carbon dioxide emissions will destroy the economy.
In actual fact, we've reached the same levels of GMP per capita that we would have achieved in 2050 between 2051 and 2052. So the cost impost is less than 0.1% of GDP.
Something like 92% of the Australian economy produces so little carbon or uses so little electricity that a carbon price of $35 will have an impact of less than 1% on its costs. So in the scheme of things, a 1% change in your cost isn't very much relative to the impact of labour wage rates, exchange rates, interest rates.
Our view is that the likely sort of carbon scheme that we're going to see won't be enough to make industries unprofitable unless they were pretty marginal to start with. I know that there has been some concern for some industries, particularly steel, that there could be some problems there. That's not really how we're seeing it.
But that's little comfort to those industries at the forefront of the carbon tax debate. BlueScope Steel's chairman, Graham Cray, addressed the National Press Club this week, accusing the government of pursuing a simplistic green agenda that would have huge economic consequences.
We are prepared to sacrifice a key sector of the Australian economy by introducing a carbon tax on Australian manufacturers, and probably with very little impact on world CO2 generation.
The Grattan Institute's John Daly has modelled the potential impact of a carbon tax on various industries and says steelmakers will be among the most vulnerable.
The profit margin will be between $100 and $200, depending on exactly how you're producing it and so on. And a carbon price of $35 for the blast furnaces, so those that are using raw iron oxide, will increase their costs by about $85.
In other words, potentially wiping out a large part of steelmakers' profit margins. But much will depend on what the carbon price is and how many free permits are given.
In terms of the heavy industries, our best estimate is that the impact will be a few percent of profit, maybe in the range of sort of 0.5% up to about 4 or possibly 6% of profit, but that would be in a more extreme sort of scenario.
The Grattan Institute's modelling shows cement makers will be in a similar position to the steel industry. A carbon price with no free permits could erase profit margins. However, John Daly says if some level of free permits is granted as expected, there should be a viable cement industry in Australia for many years. The outlook isn't so rosy, though, for aluminium smelters.
In the long run, assuming that we do move to global carbon pricing, the Australian aluminium industry is in a lot of trouble anyway. Australia has some of the most emissions-intensive electricity in the world. That's going to change, I hope, but it's not going to change very quickly. The aluminium producers around the world are all telling their investors that they're busy trying to build plants in places which have very low emissions electricity.
Citi's industry analyst Elaine Pryor says there may, however, be winners from the carbon tax, including the major listed utilities.
Although there may be some higher costs associated with their coal generation assets or exposure. Overall, we think that they'll do better out of a carbon scheme because they've got exposure to gas assets and also to renewables.
While the carbon tax debate is heavy on rhetoric, so far it's been light on detail. And the key issue still to be resolved is what price will be imposed. This week, the new head of Treasury gave the strongest indication yet. The carbon tax will start at around $26 a tonne, a level proposed under the Rudd government's CPRS.
Everything else being equal, and that is the important caveat, then the price will be no less and probably a little higher. How much? We don't know. But the everything else being equal caveat is critical because everything else is not equal.
Another question that's still being debated is why Australia should adopt a carbon price when others are not, in particular the United States and China. John Daly says renewable energy schemes in other countries are in effect a price on emissions, and a carbon price around $20 to $30 a tonne here would put Australia within the global range.
We'd probably be paying more, at least for the meantime, than is being paid in China. We'd probably be paying about the same as what will be paid, say, in California, but probably a bit less than in some of the rest of the United States. We'd be paying about the same, if not a bit less, than what's being paid in Europe.
But the chairman of the Productivity Commission, Gary Banks, says those effective carbon price estimates for countries like the US and China could be inflated by inefficient schemes, making it difficult to use them as a guide when setting policy in Australia. That's just one more sign the debate over the numbers and the appropriate policy response still has a long way to run.